Unaware. The Black Maid had just inherited $80 billion. Cold, racist millionaire CEO slapped, humiliated, and then fired her. Richard Caldwell thought firing his Black Maid was just another Tuesday morning power move. But what he didn't know was that Naomi Rivers had just become richer than he could ever dream of being, and she was about to do something so crazy it shook the Millionaire CEO. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Now let's continue. The morning Richard Caldwell slapped his Black Maid across the face and threw her belongings into the hallway. He had no idea Naomi Rivers had just inherited $80 billion from her tech mogul uncle, making her one of the wealthiest black women in America. But he was too busy screaming racial slurs to notice the estate notification glowing on her phone screen as her purse hit the marble floor at 7:42 a.m. Naomi Rivers, a 52-year-old woman who'd spent 2 decades cleaning the offices and bearing the cruelty of Caldwell Industries' CEO, stood in the executive suite holding her bruised cheek with one hand and crumpled termination papers in the other, watching the man she'd served faithfully humiliate her in front of his entire leadership team. He fired her that very morning, signing termination documents that stripped away her health insurance and pension, all because he'd spilled coffee on his own desk the night before in a drunken rage and needed someone to blame. His company was collapsing under the weight of a mysterious hostile takeover, and Richard needed to feel powerful again, even if it meant destroying a woman who'd never done anything but show up and work with dignity. But what would happen when the CEO discovered who now controlled his fate? How would the man who called her trash react when the woman he degraded became his boss? And what would Naomi do when the employer who brutalized her stood before her, realizing the maid he abused now owned everything he'd built? The day had started like every other Tuesday for the past 20 years. Naomi had arrived at Caldwell Industries headquarters at 5:30 a.m., her body aching from another sleepless night caring for her grandson Jaden. The 7-year-old boy lay at home with their neighbor Mrs. Chen, his small chest fighting for air even with the nebulizer running constantly. His asthma had worsened over the past 3 years, the attacks coming more frequently as the stress of their poverty intensified. Every missed treatment, every delayed prescription refill, every moment she spent at work instead of by his side felt like a failure she carried in her bones. She'd unlocked the executive suite with her master key, moving through the darkened hallways with the practiced efficiency of 2 decades. The notification had buzzed on her phone at 6:23 a.m. as she was preparing her cleaning cart. Patterson and Associates. The name meant nothing to her, but something about the message made her pause. She'd glanced at the preview. Urgent. Estate of Solomon Rivers. Immediate contact required. Solomon. Her uncle. The name she hadn't spoken aloud in 30 years. Her hands had trembled as she opened the message, reading words that made no sense. Inheritance, $80 billion, Rivertech Industries, sole heir. The tech genius uncle who'd left the family after a bitter dispute over land, who'd built an empire while she'd scrubbed floors, who'd apparently died and left her everything. It had to be a scam, a cruel joke. She'd tucked the phone away, her mind too foggy from exhaustion to process the impossible claim. Jaden needed his medication refilled. She needed to finish her shift. Reality was the mop in her hands, not fantasy emails about billions of dollars. She'd started cleaning Richard's office, remembering when this space had belonged to his father Edmund. Edmund Caldwell had been a good man, principled, treating every employee with dignity regardless of their position. When Naomi had first started at Caldwell Industries 20 years ago, freshly widowed and desperate for stable work to support her young daughter, Edmund had offered her not just a job, but respect. Health insurance, fair wages, a sense of belonging. But Edmund had died 5 years ago, his heart giving out suddenly one winter morning. Richard had inherited the company and transformed it within months. The dignified corporate culture his father built had rotted into something cruel and exploitative. Benefits were cut, hours extended, and Richard's treatment of Naomi had shifted from polite distance to active contempt, his microaggressions becoming open hostility as his own failures mounted. Richard had arrived early that morning, his Mercedes screeching into his reserved spot at 6:45 a.m. Naomi had heard him before she saw him, his footsteps heavy with rage as he stormed through the hallways. She'd known immediately that today would be bad. He only came in this early when he was spiraling, when the board was pressuring him, when he needed someone to punish for his inadequacies. "Naomi," he'd shouted, deliberately mispronouncing her name the way he always did. Not Naomi, but a mocking drawl that turned her identity into an insult. "Get in here now!" She'd found him in his office, staring at the coffee stain on his desk. The stain he'd made himself the night before, she knew, when he'd stayed late drinking and raging about the emergency board meeting scheduled for that afternoon. The mysterious hostile takeover that threatened to strip away his control. But Richard never took responsibility for his own messes. "This is unacceptable," he'd snarled, gesturing at the stain. "How many times do I have to tell you? You're too slow, too stupid to do even the simplest tasks." "Mr. Caldwell, I can clean that right now," she'd said quietly, maintaining the dignity that had sustained her through 20 years of his family's employment. Too late. His eyes had been bloodshot, his expensive suit wrinkled. "I'm tired of your incompetence. I'm tired of looking at you and being reminded of how far this company has fallen." The executive team had started arriving then, gathering for the pre-board meeting strategy session. Richard's voice had grown louder, performing his cruelty for an audience. Vice President James Hartwell, CFO Sandra Bennett, COO Michael Foster. They'd stood frozen in the doorway as Richard's verbal assault escalated, his words becoming sharper, more vicious, tinged with racial slurs that made even his enablers uncomfortable. "You people are all the same," he'd spat. "Lazy, entitled, thinking you deserve what you haven't earned." Naomi had felt the familiar weight of his hatred, but something in her had finally cracked. Maybe it was the sleepless nights with Jaden. Maybe it was the 20 years of service ending in abuse. Maybe it was the impossible notification still glowing on her phone in her pocket. "I've worked for your family for 20 years, she'd said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Your father respected me. He respected all his employees." The slap had come so fast she'd barely registered it. Richard's palm across her face. The crack echoing through the executive suite, her cheek exploding in pain and humiliation. His leadership team had gasped, but no one had moved to stop him. "Don't you dare speak about my father," Richard had hissed. "You're fired. Get out of my building. Security!" The termination papers had been prepared in advance, she'd realized later. He'd planned this, needed this release valve for his own failures. The documents cited chronic incompetence and inability to meet basic standards, stripping away not just her job, but her health insurance, her pension, everything she'd earned over 2 decades of loyal service. Security had escorted her through the building as arriving employees stared. Richard had followed, his rage still burning, and in the lobby he'd grabbed her purse and thrown it, sending her belongings scattering across the marble floor. Her phone had skittered toward the reception desk, the screen still showing the notification from Patterson and Associates, the message about $80 billion that Richard was too blind with fury to notice. Now, hours later, Naomi sat in her small apartment, her scattered belongings finally gathered, her bruised cheek throbbing. The termination papers lay on the kitchen counter beside her phone. 2 realities that couldn't coexist, but somehow did. She read the notification again, her hand steadier now. Solomon Rivers, had died. Her estranged uncle, the tech genius who'd revolutionized cloud computing, had left her his entire empire, and the attorney needed to see her that afternoon at 5:00 p.m., the same time as Richard's emergency board meeting. Naomi thought about calling someone, sharing this impossible news. But something stopped her. Not pride this time. Something else. The memory of Richard's hand across her face. The 20 years of dignity she'd maintained despite his cruelty. The realization that a man who could abuse a woman for his own failures didn't deserve to know what she'd just inherited. She called the law firm instead, confirmed the meeting, and began to understand that within hours, everything would change. Richard sat in his office right now, preparing to save his company from the mysterious hostile takeover, already forgetting about the maid he'd destroyed that morning. He had no idea that the woman whose purse he'd thrown across the lobby now controlled more wealth than he'd ever seen. He had no idea that by 5:00 p.m., Naomi Rivers would walk into his emergency board meeting as the majority shareholder of everything he'd built. And when that moment came, when he saw her standing there flanked by attorneys, when he realized what he'd thrown away, the expression on his face would be worth every year of suffering she'd endured. 20 years ago, Naomi Rivers had walked through the glass doors of Caldwell Industries for the first time, with nothing but a recommendation letter from her church and the desperate hope that comes from having no other options. She'd been 32 years old, recently widowed when her husband collapsed from an undiagnosed heart condition, left alone to raise their 10-year-old daughter Maya on a factory worker's life insurance policy that barely covered the funeral costs. The woman who'd greeted her that October morning hadn't been a HR manager, but Edmund Caldwell himself, the company's founder and CEO. He'd been in his early 60s then, silver-haired and dignified in a way that spoke of old money tempered by genuine principle. His office had been modest compared to the ostentatious space his son would later occupy, decorated with family photos and employee appreciation plaques rather than status symbols. "Mrs. Rivers," he'd said, shaking her hand with real warmth, "Pastor Williams speaks very highly of your character. Tell me about yourself." She'd been honest because she'd had nothing left to lose. A widow, a daughter to support, no college degree, willing to work any hours, any position, just a chance to provide stability for her child. Edmund had listened without judgment, nodding thoughtfully. "I built this company on the principle that every person deserves dignity in their work," he'd told her. "I need someone to manage our executive office maintenance, someone trustworthy and dedicated. The position includes full health insurance, retirement contributions, and fair wages. But more than that, you'll be treated with the respect every employee in this building deserves." She'd started the next week, and Edmund had kept every promise. The health insurance had covered Maya's braces and annual checkups. The wages had allowed them to move from their cramped apartment into a small house with a yard. But beyond the practical benefits, Edmund had given her something more precious: respect. He'd learned her name correctly on the first day and never mispronounced it. He'd asked about Maya's school performances. He'd included her in the company holiday celebrations, not as staff, but as family. Young Richard had been 30 then, ambitious and polished, working his way up through the company under his father's careful guidance. He'd been married to Diana for 3 years, and their infant daughter Caroline had often accompanied her grandmother to the office. Naomi remembered Richard as driven but not yet cruel, focused on proving himself to his father rather than dominating others. He'd been distant with her, professional but never warm, seeing her as part of the office landscape rather than a person worth knowing. Diana Caldwell had been kind in those early years, though always slightly removed, a woman who'd married into wealth and wore it like armor against the world's complexities. She'd been involved in the company's charitable initiatives, her photograph appearing in society pages at fundraising galas, but she'd always treated Naomi with polite courtesy. The golden years had stretched across a decade and a half. Naomi had watched Caroline grow from an infant into a bright, sensitive teenager who'd sometimes seek her out during after-school hours when Diana was busy with social obligations. Caroline had done her homework in the break room while Naomi worked, chattering about her classes and friends, treating Naomi like an aunt rather than an employee. Those conversations had reminded Naomi of her own daughter, creating a bond that transcended their different circumstances. Edmund's business philosophy had permeated every aspect of Caldwell Industries. He'd believed that ethical leadership created sustainable success, that employee welfare translated directly to company prosperity, that community responsibility was not just good PR but moral obligation. He'd maintained profit margins without exploiting workers, expanded the business without destroying competitors, built wealth without sacrificing principles. Under his leadership, Caldwell Industries had been known not just for financial success, but for corporate integrity. Richard had risen through the ranks during those years, from junior executive to vice president to heir apparent. Edmund had mentored him carefully, trying to instill those same values, but Naomi had noticed something hardening in Richard as he climbed, an impatience with his father's measured approach, a hunger for faster growth, bigger profits, more visible power. He'd started pushing for aggressive tactics that Edmund quietly rejected, creating friction between father and son that everyone pretended not to notice. Naomi's own life had blossomed alongside the company's growth. Maya had graduated from State College with a nursing degree, gotten married to a good man named David, and given Naomi the greatest gift of her life when Jaden was born. Those had been joyful years, watching her grandson take his first steps in the small house her Caldwell Industries salary had helped her keep, dreaming of the future that seemed so bright and certain. Then tragedy had shattered everything in a single moment. Maya and David had been driving home from a dinner celebration for their 3rd anniversary when a drunk driver ran a red light. David had died instantly. Maya had held on for 3 days in the ICU before her injuries proved too severe. Naomi had been left with 2-year-old Jaden, her world demolished, barely able to breathe through the grief. Edmund and Diana had been remarkable in that dark time. Edmund had quietly adjusted Naomi's schedule, allowing her to bring Jaden to work when childcare failed, never once suggesting her tragedy should interfere with her employment. Diana had sent meals to Naomi's house for weeks, had connected her with a grief counselor, had treated her loss as a family loss rather than an employee issue. Even Richard had shown flashes of humanity then, his condolence card including a substantial donation to Maya's memorial fund. But Edmund's own time had been running short, though none of them had known it. 5 years ago, on a cold February morning, he'd suffered a massive heart attack in his office. Naomi had found him, had called 911, had held his hand while they waited for the ambulance. He'd died before reaching the hospital, his final words to her a whispered, "Take care of yourself." The transformation had been swift and brutal. Richard had inherited control of Caldwell Industries, and within weeks the company his father built began to mutate into something unrecognizable. The first changes had been financial, cutting employee benefits to boost short-term profits, demanding longer hours without additional compensation, eliminating the community programs Edmund had cherished. But the cultural shift had been even more devastating. Diana had withdrawn completely after Edmund's death, selling their family home and moving to a countryside estate where she could grieve in isolation. Without her tempering presence, without his father's moral authority, Richard had revealed the man he'd apparently always been beneath the carefully maintained veneer. His treatment of employees had shifted from professional distance to active contempt, particularly toward those like Naomi who'd been close to his father, who represented the values he was systematically dismantling. His contempt for Naomi had grown more obvious with each passing month. The polite distance had become cold dismissal, then deliberate disrespect, then open cruelty. He'd started mispronouncing her name, leaving messes for her to clean during client meetings, complaining about her work in front of others, treating her as property rather than a person. She'd endured it because Jaden needed the health insurance, because jobs were scarce for women her age without degrees, because she'd believed that loyalty and dignity would eventually matter. Richard had surrounded himself with executives who enabled his worst instincts. James Hartwell, Sandra Bennett, Michael Foster, others who laughed at his cruel jokes, who implemented his exploitative policies, who treated vulnerable employees as disposable resources. Some had seemed uncomfortable with his behavior, but none had challenged him. Their own careers and stock options too valuable to risk on principle. Naomi had started documenting the incidents 2 years ago, writing in a private journal she kept locked in her desk at home, not because she'd believed anyone would care, but because she'd needed to preserve her own sanity, to confirm that what was happening was real and wrong. The journal had grown thick with examples. Richard mocking Jaden's illness, forcing her to work through family emergencies, using racial slurs when he thought no one important was listening, creating hostile conditions that drove good employees away. What Naomi hadn't known, what she couldn't have known, was that someone else had been documenting Richard's cruelty too, someone with far more resources and far greater reach. Solomon Rivers, her uncle, the tech genius she hadn't spoken to in 30 years. The estrangement had roots that stretched back 3 decades, to a family dispute that had seemed monumental then, but felt petty now in hindsight. Naomi's father and Solomon had inherited family land in rural Georgia from their parents, 20 acres that had been in the Rivers family for generations. Solomon had wanted to sell, to use the money to fund his technology startup. Her father had wanted to keep it, to preserve family heritage. The argument had escalated into something bitter and unforgivable, words spoken that couldn't be taken back, family bonds severed over property and pride. Young Naomi had taken her father's side automatically, seeing Solomon's ambitions as betrayal of family legacy. When Solomon had left, moving to California to build Rivertech Industries from nothing, she'd written him off as selfish and greedy. She'd never responded to his occasional letters, had ignored his attempts at reconciliation, had let pride and stubbornness prevent healing. Solomon had built his empire anyway. Rivertech Industries had revolutionized cloud computing, had made Solomon one of the most successful black entrepreneurs in American history, had created wealth that dwarfed anything the Rivers family had previously imagined. Naomi had followed his success from a distance, seeing his name in business magazines, feeling a complex mixture of pride and resentment that she'd never examined too closely. What she hadn't known was that Solomon had been watching her too, that 3 years ago, concerned by rumors of her circumstances, he'd hired private investigators to check on his estranged niece, that those investigators had documented not just her poverty, but Richard's abuse, had compiled evidence that Solomon had quietly passed to attorneys, had prepared a legal strategy that would only activate upon his death. Solomon had been diagnosed with terminal cancer 6 months ago, and he'd made his final decision. Naomi would inherit everything, and she'd have the power to seek justice, but those revelations were still hours away, waiting in Gerald Patterson's downtown office. For now, Naomi sat in her kitchen with 20 years of memories and a phone number for a law firm she'd never heard of, wondering if her uncle's death would finally give her what 2 decades of dignity and loyalty never had, the power to fight back. The bus ride downtown took 45 minutes. 45 minutes Naomi spent convincing herself this was real and not some elaborate scam targeting vulnerable people in their lowest moments. Her cheeks still throbbed where Richard had struck her, a physical reminder that her old life had ended violently that morning. The termination papers sat folded in her purse next to the phone, displaying Gerald Patterson's follow-up message. "Ms. Rivers, This is urgent and legitimate. Your uncle's estate cannot be settled without your presence. 3:00 p.m. today. Please confirm. She'd called back during the transfer at 5th Street, her voice shaking as she confirmed the appointment. Gerald Patterson had sounded kind but professional, assuring her this was not a mistake, that she was indeed Solomon Rivers' sole heir, that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. She'd hung up feeling numb, watching the city pass by through scratched bus windows, unable to reconcile the woman who'd been slapped and fired this morning with the woman who might be inheriting billions. Mrs. Chen had agreed to keep Jaden through dinner, sensing something significant was happening, though Naomi couldn't bring herself to explain what. The boy had been sleeping when she'd stopped home to change, his breathing finally steady with the nebulizer running. She'd kissed his forehead and whispered a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. Everything's going to be okay. Patterson and Associates occupied the entire 30th floor of the Merchant's Tower, its lobby a statement of power and permanence with marble floors and glass walls offering panoramic city views. Naomi felt immediately out of place in her simple dress and worn shoes, surrounded by people in expensive suits moving with the confidence that came from never doubting their right to occupy space. The receptionist had been professionally courteous, but Naomi had seen the brief flicker of assessment in her eyes, the subtle surprise that someone who looked like Naomi was there for a senior partner. Gerald Patterson had met her personally at the elevator, and his appearance had provided the first moment of comfort since she'd received the notification. He was in his late 60s, a distinguished black man with silver temples and warm brown eyes that held both competence and compassion. His handshake was firm, his smile genuine as he guided her down hallways lined with awards and photographs of the firm's most significant victories. "Ms. Rivers, thank you for coming on such short notice," he'd said, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone accustomed to delivering life-changing news. "I know this must be overwhelming, but I promise everything will make sense shortly." The conference room was larger than Naomi's entire apartment, its long tables surrounded by leather chairs and walls of law books that probably cost more than she'd earned in a year. But it wasn't the opulence that made her breath catch. It was the people waiting inside. 6 attorneys in addition to Gerald, each with thick folders arranged before them. 3 financial advisors with laptops open, screens displaying numbers and charts, and at the head of the table, a video screen showing a paused image of Solomon Rivers, her uncle, looking older than she remembered but still recognizably the young man who'd left Georgia 30 years ago. "Please, sit," Gerald said, indicating a chair at the table's center. "I know this seems formal, but your uncle's estate is complex, and we wanted to ensure everything was explained thoroughly." Naomi sat, her hands trembling as she placed her purse on the floor. The attorneys and advisors introduced themselves, but their names blurred together in her overwhelmed mind. She caught fragments: estate planning, securities law, corporate governance, wealth management, words that belonged in a different universe than the one she'd inhabited that morning. Gerald cleared his throat and began the reading of Solomon Rivers' last will and testament. The legal language was dense, but the meaning crystallized with shocking clarity as he progressed through the document. Solomon Rivers, founder and CEO of Rivertech Industries, had died 6 weeks ago after a brief battle with pancreatic cancer. His estate, valued at approximately $80 billion, included complete ownership of Rivertech Industries, commercial real estate holdings across 15 states, residential properties in 8 countries, investment portfolios spanning every major market, and liquid assets that alone exceeded most people's wildest dreams. And he'd left everything to Naomi Rivers, his sole surviving niece, with no restrictions, no conditions, no strings attached. "That can't be right," Naomi whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. 80 billion? That's not possible. Why would he leave me anything after 30 years of silence? We were estranged, I never responded to his letters. I chose my father over him in that dispute. Gerald's expression softened with something like paternal affection. Your uncle was very clear about his reasoning, Ms. Rivers. He left you a personal letter that I believe will answer your questions. He produced an envelope from his folder, its surface bearing Solomon's distinctive handwriting. For Naomi, when the time comes. Naomi's hands shook so badly she could barely open it. The letter was handwritten. Several pages of Solomon's careful script, and reading it felt like hearing his voice after 3 decades of silence. My dear Naomi, it began, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you're probably sitting in Gerald's office wondering why a man you haven't spoken to in 30 years just upended your life. Let me explain. I was a coward. That dispute with your father was about more than land. It was about pride, about proving myself, about being too stubborn to admit I was wrong to let property destroy family bonds. I left angry and built my empire partly to prove I didn't need the Rivers family. But success without connection is hollow, and I spent 30 years regretting words I couldn't take back. I tried to reach out over the years. Letters, cards, attempts at reconciliation that you ignored, and I don't blame you. You were loyal to your father as you should have been. I was the one who left, who chose ambition over family. The estrangement was my fault, not yours. 3 years ago, I hired private investigators to check on you, not to intrude, but to ensure you were okay, to see if the niece I remembered had found happiness. What they discovered broke my heart. Your daughter's death, your grandson's illness, your poverty despite decades of hard work, and worst of all, the systematic abuse you endured at Caldwell Industries. I documented everything, Naomi. Richard Caldwell's cruelty, his discrimination, his exploitation, not just of you, but of dozens of vulnerable employees. I had my legal team gather evidence, prepare strategies, build a case that would bring him to justice. But I wanted to do more than destroy one cruel man. I wanted to give you the power to transform your own life and the lives of others. 6 months ago, the doctors told me I had pancreatic cancer. Stage 4, inoperable, maybe a year if I was lucky. I didn't get the year, but I got enough time to ensure this inheritance would reach you properly, that you'd have the resources and support to use it wisely. This fortune means nothing if it can't lift you up and bring down those who abuse power. Rivertech Industries is yours now. Use it to build something better. The $80 billion is yours. Use it to create justice, not just for yourself, but for everyone Richard Caldwell has harmed. I'm sorry I never had the courage to reconcile while I was alive. I'm sorry I missed watching you raise your daughter, meeting your grandson, being the uncle you deserved. But I watched you from afar these past 3 years, and I saw something I'd lost along the way. Dignity in the face of cruelty, grace under impossible pressure, strength that didn't require wealth or power to be real. Make me proud, Naomi. Not by being me, not by building another empire, but by being you, just with the resources to make your compassion and strength matter on a scale that can change lives. The Rivers family was never about land or money. It was about people who survived and thrived against impossible odds. You've already proven you're the best of us. Now prove what the best of us can do when given real power. With love and regret, your Uncle Solomon. Naomi's tears fell on the paper, blurring the ink. Grief for the uncle she'd never really known mixed with gratitude for his impossible gift. With rage at the 30 years they'd lost to pride, with overwhelming confusion about what came next. Gerald handed her tissue silently, letting her process, understanding that some moments needed space rather than words. When she could finally speak, her voice was hoarse. He watched Richard abuse me for 3 years and didn't intervene? He wanted to, Gerald said gently. But he believed that simply rescuing you would have been another form of control. another powerful man making decisions for you. He wanted to give you the power to rescue yourself, to make your own choices about justice and transformation. One of the other attorneys, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, leaned forward. "Ms. Rivers, I'm Patricia Howard, corporate litigation specialist. Your uncle hired me 3 years ago to prepare for this moment. With your permission, I'd like to explain what we've already set in motion." Naomi wiped her eyes and nodded, feeling like she was watching herself from outside her body. Patricia's smile was fierce and calculating. "Caldwell Industries is bankrupt, Ms. Rivers. Richard Caldwell has been cooking the books for years, using creative accounting to hide massive losses while maintaining his lifestyle. The company is facing a hostile takeover that's been systematically buying up shares over the past 72 hours. She paused for effect. "That hostile takeover is us. Shell corporations I created using your uncle's resources. As of this morning, we control 51% of Caldwell Industries. Richard has called an emergency board meeting for 5 o'clock today to announce what he believes is a savior investor who will rescue his company." Understanding crashed over Naomi like a wave. "I'm the investor." "You're not just the investor, Ms. Rivers. You're the majority shareholder. You own his company, and the board has already voted, contingent on your approval, to remove Richard Caldwell from all leadership positions effective immediately upon your arrival." David Chen, one of the financial advisors, spoke up. "Ms. Rivers, you currently control assets worth approximately $80 billion. That makes you one of the wealthiest black women in America and one of the most powerful people in this city. The question isn't whether you can afford to buy Caldwell Industries. The question is whether you want to transform it or destroy it," Patricia continued, her voice steady with professional intensity. "This morning's assault was captured on security footage. We have copies, and they're ready to be released to major news networks. We also have 3 years of documented evidence of Richard's discrimination, harassment, and financial crimes. His executives, several of whom are facing their own legal exposure, have already provided sworn statements in exchange for immunity. When you walk into that board meeting today, you won't just have money and shares. You'll have truth, documentation, and justice." Naomi's mind reeled. Why didn't Solomon just destroy Richard himself? Why wait until after his death? Gerald answered softly. "Because your uncle believed that justice achieved by others on your behalf was just another form of powerlessness. He wanted you to choose, to decide what justice means, to build something that reflects your values rather than his. The tools are yours. The choice is yours. The power is yours." The room fell silent, waiting for her response. Outside the windows, the city stretched endlessly, the same city where she'd been slapped and fired that morning, where Richard Caldwell sat in his office preparing his presentation, oblivious to the reckoning approaching with his former maid's face. Naomi thought about Jaden, struggling to breathe in their small apartment. About 20 years of dignity maintained despite cruelty. About her daughter Maya, who'd deserved better than early death, and a mother too poor to properly grieve. About all the other employees Richard had exploited, all the vulnerable people crushed by men who wielded power without accountability. "Not revenge," she said finally, her voice stronger than she'd expected. "Justice. Transformation. I want to buy his company, yes. I want him removed from power, absolutely. But I want to build something better from what he destroyed. I want every employee he exploited to benefit. I want to prove that ethical leadership creates real success, not just profit for people at the top." Patricia's smile widened. "Then let's go introduce you to your board of directors, Ms. Rivers. Richard Caldwell is expecting a savior. Let's show him salvation has a very different face than he imagined." Richard Caldwell stood at his office window, watching the city sprawl beneath him, and felt powerful for the first time in weeks. Firing that woman had been necessary, cathartic even. She'd been a reminder of his father's soft policies, of the dignity-obsessed leadership style that had nearly bankrupted the company. Getting rid of her felt like shedding dead weight, like finally taking the ruthless actions required to save Caldwell Industries. The feeling lasted approximately 15 minutes. His assistant Jennifer knocked timidly, entering with a stack of reports that made Richard's stomach clench. "Mr. Caldwell, the quarterly financials just came from accounting. And sir, there are 17 calls holding from creditors. They're saying it's urgent." Richard snatched the reports, his hands already trembling as he scanned the numbers. The losses were worse than he'd feared. Catastrophically worse. Revenue down 43%. Operating costs inflated by his lavish spending. Debt service consuming what little cash flow remained. The creative accounting he'd employed to hide the bleeding had only delayed the inevitable, and now the bill was coming due in ways that couldn't be hidden or explained away. His phone lit up with another call. Pinnacle Credit Services. Then another. Fortress Capital Management. Creditors who'd extended lines of credit based on fraudulent financial statements were now demanding payment, threatening lawsuits, using words like criminal investigation and securities fraud. But worse than the creditors was the notification from his stock monitoring service. Someone was buying Caldwell Industries shares aggressively, systematically, driving the price up while accumulating a position that suggested hostile intent. Richard had spent the past 3 days trying to identify the buyer, but the purchases were coming through shell corporations with opaque ownership structures. His investment bankers were baffled. His lawyers were concerned. His board members were asking questions he couldn't answer. He'd called Lawrence Fitzpatrick, the board chair, that morning after firing Naomi. Lawrence had been oddly distant, his usual deference replaced by careful neutrality. "Richard, the board is concerned about these share purchases and the quarterly numbers. We've scheduled an emergency meeting for 5 o'clock. You'll need to present a clear plan for stabilization." "I have a plan," Richard had insisted, his voice higher than he'd intended. "I've secured a white knight investor, someone with deep pockets and industry connections. Everything will be fine once the board approves the deal." "We'll see," Lawrence had said, and the lack of confidence in those 2 words had terrified Richard more than the creditor's threats. Now, as afternoon shadows lengthened across his office, Richard rehearsed his presentation with increasing desperation. The white knight investor he'd referenced was supposedly represented by a man named Robert Ashford, who'd approached Richard 3 weeks ago with promises of capital infusion and strategic partnership. Robert had been everything Richard wanted in an investor. White, male, Ivy League educated, connected to old money families. Their lunch meeting had gone well, with Robert asking all the right questions and expressing admiration for Richard's bold leadership style. Richard clung to that meeting like a life raft, convinced that Robert's investment would save everything. He'd prepared elaborate slides showing projected growth, market opportunities, competitive advantages, all the business school rhetoric that had once impressed his father's generation. He refused to acknowledge the reality that his projections were built on sand, that Caldwell Industries was fundamentally broken by his own mismanagement and exploitation. His CFO, Sandra Bennett, had tried to warn him that morning, her voice tight with stress. "Richard, we need to discuss the ethical violations the auditors flagged, the discriminatory hiring patterns, the wage theft allegations, the buried harassment settlements. If the board investigates deeper, if any of this becomes public, we're looking at massive liability." "Handle it," Richard had snapped, dismissing her concerns with the same arrogance that had characterized his entire tenure. "The board cares about profits, not some HR nonsense. Once Robert's investment comes through, none of this will matter." Sandra had left his office looking defeated, and Richard had felt a flicker of unease at her expression. But he'd buried it beneath the same denial that had allowed him to ignore warning signs for 5 years. His daughter Caroline had tried to see him twice that afternoon, but Richard had refused both times. He didn't have energy for her judgmental looks, her implicit criticism of his leadership style, her disturbing tendency to side with employees over management. Caroline had become soft like her grandfather, infected with the same weakness that prioritized people over profits. He'd deal with her after the board meeting, after his triumph, when he had time to remind her which side of the class divide she belonged on. What Richard didn't know was that Caroline had spent the morning crying in the executive bathroom, replaying the moment her father's hand struck Naomi's face, the sound echoing in her memory like a gunshot. Caroline Caldwell was 25 years old, and that morning had shattered whatever remained of her illusions about her father. She'd arrived early for a breakfast meeting with the marketing team and had witnessed the entire scene from the hallway outside his office. Naomi, dignified despite exhaustion, trying to maintain professional composure. Her father, volatile and cruel, his words escalating from criticism to slurs, the slap that had made Caroline's stomach turn, the humiliation, the firing, the physical removal of a woman who'd been more present in Caroline's childhood than her own mother. Memories flooded back as she sat in her own office, door locked, phone silenced. Naomi in the break room after school, helping with math homework while her mother attended charity galas. Naomi listening to teenage heartbreak with genuine compassion while her father worked late building his empire. Naomi at Maya's funeral, holding Caroline's hand because Diana had been too consumed by her own grief to notice her daughter's tears. Naomi had been family in ways that transcended employment, and watching her father destroy her had felt like watching him destroy the last connection to the grandfather Caroline had loved. But Caroline's horror that morning hadn't been surprise. She'd watched her father's transformation over 5 years, had documented his increasing cruelty, had finally taken action 6 months ago when she could no longer reconcile filial loyalty with moral responsibility. The first meeting with Patricia Howard had been terrifying. Caroline had found the attorney through a law school friend, had arrived at the initial consultation shaking with fear and guilt. "I think my father is committing crimes," she'd said. "I think he's hurting people. And I need to know what I can do to stop him without destroying innocent employees." Patricia had listened with the focused intensity that had made her legendary in corporate litigation circles. Over subsequent meetings, Caroline had provided documentation, witness names, patterns of behavior that constituted systematic discrimination and harassment. She'd felt like a traitor with every piece of evidence she surrendered, but the alternative was complicity in her father's cruelty. "You're not betraying your family," Patricia had told her during one particularly difficult session. "You're honoring what your family should be. Your grandfather built Caldwell Industries on principles your father is destroying. Sometimes loyalty means saving something from the person who's killing it." Caroline had agreed to testify when the time came, knowing it would sever her relationship with her father permanently. She'd made peace with that cost. What she hadn't known until this afternoon was exactly when that testimony would be required. Patricia had called her at 2 o'clock. "It's happening today. The board meeting at 5. Can you be there?" "I'll be there," Caroline had promised, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I'll tell them everything." Throughout Caldwell Industries' executive floor, Richard's leadership team was fracturing in ways he remained oblivious to. In corner offices and conference rooms, his hand-picked executives were making calculations about survival that didn't include loyalty to their CEO. James Hartwell, the CFO who'd enabled Richard's creative accounting, sat in his office reviewing the immunity agreement Patricia Howard's team had offered him 3 days ago. He'd signed it that morning, turned over financial records documenting years of fraud, and was now waiting for the hammer to fall. His motivations weren't particularly noble. He simply recognized that Richard was going down, and he preferred cooperation to prosecution. In the break room, VP of Operations Michael Foster and VP of Human Resources Linda Chen spoke in hushed tones about the assault they'd witnessed. Neither had intervened, both had remained silent, and now both were grappling with their complicity. "We should have stopped him," Linda said, her coffee untouched. "Naomi worked here for 20 years. She didn't deserve that." "What could we have done?" Michael replied, but his defensiveness sounded hollow even to himself. "Richard would have fired us too. Maybe that would have been better than what's coming," Linda said quietly. She'd already provided a sworn statement to Patricia's investigators, detailing every discriminatory policy she'd been ordered to implement, every harassment complaint she'd been told to bury. Her immunity deal was contingent on full cooperation, and she'd cooperated completely, motivated by self-preservation masquerading as conscience. Some of Richard's executives genuinely regretted their complicity. Sandra Bennett, despite enabling his financial crimes, had lost sleep over the employees whose lives were destroyed by cost-cutting measures. She'd provided evidence hoping it might protect vulnerable workers, even as it condemned her boss. Others, like VP of Sales Brandon Foster, felt no remorse at all, but recognized that Richard's ship was sinking and jumped to the lifeboats of immunity deals with purely mercenary efficiency. What unified them all was the realization that Richard Caldwell had created a culture so toxic, so legally exposed, that everyone adjacent to him was now facing potential liability, and turning on him wasn't just pragmatic. It was survival. By 4:30, as Richard was perfecting his presentation slides and imagining his triumphant salvation of the company, his entire executive team had already betrayed him. Sworn statements sat in Patricia Howard's files. Immunity agreements protected those who'd cooperated. Caroline was preparing her testimony. The board had been briefed on the evidence they'd review, and Richard knew none of it. He stood in front of his mirror, straightening his tie, practicing the confident smile he'd deploy when introducing Robert Ashford and the salvation he represented. He imagined the board's relief, their gratitude, the restoration of his authority. He thought about calling his mother Diana to share the good news after the meeting, about proving he could succeed without his father's cautious principles. He never once considered that the woman he'd slapped that morning might be connected to his company's mysterious hostile takeover. Never imagined that his savior investor was actually an actress Patricia had hired. Never suspected that every person he'd trusted had already abandoned him. Richard Caldwell walked toward the board meeting, convinced he was about to save his empire, when in reality, he was walking toward its complete destruction. And the architect of that destruction would be wearing the face of the maid he'd thrown away like garbage, now transformed into the most powerful person in the room. The reckoning was 17 minutes away, but Richard spent those final moments adjusting his cufflinks and rehearsing his opening lines, blissfully ignorant that the only question remaining was how publicly his fall would be documented. His assistant Jennifer watched him leave for the conference room, and her expression held something close to pity. She'd been interviewed by Patricia's team too, had provided testimony about Richard's behavior, had secured her own immunity. She wondered if she should warn him, but decided that some lessons had to be learned the hard way. Besides, after what she'd witnessed him do to Naomi that morning, a small part of her wanted him to walk unprepared into the devastation waiting in that conference room. Sometimes justice required surprise. Sometimes the powerful needed to experience the same helplessness they'd inflicted on others. Richard disappeared down the hallway, shoulders back, chin high, convinced his charm and business acumen would save him one more time. Jennifer returned to her desk and pulled up the security footage from that morning, the footage Patricia had requested copies of, the footage that was being delivered to news networks right now on a coordinated release schedule. In 17 minutes, Richard Caldwell's world would end. But for just a few minutes more, he walked in ignorance toward the conference room, still believing he was the hero of his own story. The styling team Patricia hired worked with military precision, transforming Naomi from fired maid to billionaire executive in under 2 hours. They'd met her at an exclusive boutique on Fifth Avenue, a place Naomi had walked past 1,000 times without ever imagining she'd enter. The owner had closed the shop for their private appointment, and salespeople had brought out options that cost more than Naomi used to earn in a month. She'd chosen a tailored navy suit, elegant but powerful, with clean lines that spoke of authority without ostentation. The fabric felt like liquid against her skin, nothing like the discount store clothes that had comprised her wardrobe for 20 years. Professional shoes that actually fit properly. A simple watch that probably cost more than her old car. The makeup artist had worked carefully around her bruised cheek, concealing Richard's handprint while somehow making the injury more dignified than shameful. Her hair, usually pulled back in a practical style, had been shaped into something sophisticated. When they'd finally finished and turned her toward the mirror, Naomi had barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked powerful. She looked wealthy. She looked like someone who belonged in boardrooms and executive suites. But beneath the expensive clothes and professional styling, she was still Naomi Rivers, still the woman who'd held her dying daughter's hand, still the grandmother who ran nebulizer treatments at 3 a.m, still the person who knew what it meant to be powerless. "How do you feel?" Patricia had asked, watching Naomi's reflection with satisfaction. "Like I'm wearing a costume," Naomi admitted, touching the suit jacket hesitantly. "Like I'm pretending to be someone I'm not." "You're not pretending," Patricia said firmly. "This is who you are now. The woman who scrubbed floors was the real you. This woman is also the real you. You're just seeing what you look like when the world treats you according to your actual worth instead of Richard Caldwell's assessment." Naomi had processed that in silence, feeling grief for Uncle Solomon mixed with rage at Richard, with cautious hope that maybe, possibly, justice could actually mean something. She'd called Mrs. Chen from the boutique to check on Jaden. The boy was stable, playing video games, his breathing clear for the moment. Naomi had promised to be home for dinner, though she suspected that promise might be complicated by whatever happened in the next few hours. "I'm doing this for him," she'd told Patricia as they'd prepared to leave. "For Jaden. For every worker Richard exploited. For my daughter who deserved better than what this world gave her. I want to build something that matters. Something that proves power doesn't have to corrupt." "Then let's go show Richard Caldwell what real power looks like," Patricia had replied. The luxury sedan that picked them up was absurdly comfortable, all leather and technology and smooth silence. Naomi sat in back with Patricia while 2 other attorneys occupied the front seats, reviewing final details on tablets. They'd arrived at Caldwell Industries at exactly 4:53 p.m., 7 minutes before the board meeting's scheduled start. Walking through those lobby doors felt surreal. Naomi had entered this building thousands of times over 20 years, always through the service entrance, always before dawn or after hours, always invisible to the executives and clients who occupied the space during business hours. Now she walked through the front entrance in daylight, flanked by attorneys, and employees stopped mid-conversation to stare. Some recognized her immediately. Robert from accounting, who'd always said good morning. Lisa from marketing, who'd once helped Naomi when she'd twisted her ankle on the stairs. Their expressions cycled rapidly from confusion to shock to something like vindication, as if they'd always suspected Naomi deserved better than Richard's cruelty. Others didn't recognize her at all, seeing only an elegantly dressed black woman with an entourage of lawyers, their minds not making the connection between the maid and the mogul. Their stares held different qualities: curiosity, assessment, the automatic respect wealthy people received in spaces designed to venerate wealth. Naomi's emotions threatened to overwhelm her with each step. This building held 20 years of memories, both beautiful and terrible. The break room where she'd helped Caroline with homework. The bathroom where she'd cried after her daughter's funeral. The executive suite where Richard had struck her that morning. Every floor she'd scrubbed. Every window she'd cleaned. Every moment of dignity maintained despite humiliation. Security had tried to stop them at the elevator, recognizing Naomi as the woman who'd been fired and physically removed that morning. "Ma'am, you're not authorized to be here. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Patricia had stepped forward, presenting documentation with the confidence of someone accustomed to destroying obstacles. "Ms. Rivers owns 51% of this company as of this afternoon. She's authorized to be anywhere she chooses. You can verify with the board chair if necessary, but I suggest you let us pass before you obstruct a majority shareholder." The guard had made a call, received confirmation that left him visibly confused, and stepped aside. They'd ridden the elevator in silence, Naomi's heart pounding so hard she worried everyone could hear it. Patricia had squeezed her hand once, a gesture of solidarity that steadied her. The executive conference room was on the top floor, its entrance marked by double doors of polished wood. Through the glass panels, Naomi could see the board members already gathered around the massive table. 12 people in expensive suits, faces she'd seen in company newsletters and annual reports, the power structure that had enabled Richard's cruelty through their passive oversight. Richard stood at the head of the table, presentation slides ready on the screen behind him, his body language radiating false confidence. He was mid-sentence when Patricia pushed open the doors, cutting off whatever charm offensive he'd been deploying. The room fell absolutely silent. Naomi entered flanked by Patricia and the other attorneys, and watched Richard's expression transform in real time. Confusion came first, his mind struggling to place why his fired maid was interrupting his board meeting in a designer suit. Then recognition, his eyes widening as he processed her presence. Then horror, his face literally draining of color as some instinct whispered that this was very, very wrong. Lawrence Fitzpatrick, the board chair, stood with the formality of someone executing an unpleasant but necessary duty. "Mr. Caldwell, I'd like to introduce Ms. Naomi Rivers. As of 4 o'clock this afternoon, Mrs. Rivers is the majority shareholder of Caldwell Industries, controlling 51% of company stock. She is also the heir to the Solomon Rivers fortune, valued at approximately $80 billion. He paused, letting that information detonate in the room. "The board has voted unanimously to remove you from all leadership positions effective immediately. Ms. Rivers will assume the role of CEO, pending her acceptance." Richard laughed. It was a desperate, unhinged sound that made several board members shift uncomfortably. "This is a joke, right? Some kind of elaborate prank? She's a maid. She was fired this morning. She can't possibly be. This is insane." "It's quite real, Mr. Caldwell," Patricia said, her voice sharp as broken glass. "I'm Patricia Howard, Ms. Rivers' lead attorney. We've been systematically purchasing Caldwell Industries shares through shell corporations for the past 72 hours. The documentation is ironclad. Your maid, as you so dismissively call her, now owns your company." Richard's laughter died, replaced by rage so intense his whole body shook. "This is illegal. It's fraud. I'll challenge this in court. I'll sue everyone in this room. I'll destroy all of you." Patricia opened her briefcase with deliberate calm, producing a stack of folders that landed on the conference table with satisfying weight. "You're welcome to try, Mr. Caldwell, but I should warn you that we have rather extensive documentation of your own illegal activities. Perhaps you'd like to review the evidence before making threats." "This is betrayal," Richard shouted, wheeling on Lawrence and the board members. "You're supposed to support me. Where's Robert? Where's my investor?" "There is no Robert," Lawrence said quietly. "There never was. It was part of the strategy to keep you distracted while the share purchase is finalized." Richard turned on Naomi then, his rage finding its most familiar target. "You think you can walk in here and take what's mine? You think you're qualified to run anything? You're nothing but hired help. He used a racial slur that made even the most hardened board members flinch. "You think changing your clothes makes you anything other than what you are?" Naomi remained absolutely still throughout his tirade, her face calm despite the storm raging in her chest. She'd expected his hatred, had steeled herself for it, but hearing it directed at her with such venom in front of witnesses felt like vindication rather than assault. Every word he screamed was evidence of everything she'd endured, everything Solomon had documented, everything that made his removal necessary. Patricia let Richard exhaust himself before speaking. "Are you finished, Mr. Caldwell? Because we have quite a bit to show the board." She nodded to one of the other attorneys, who connected a laptop to the conference room's presentation system. "What you're about to see represents 3 years of investigation into Richard Caldwell's leadership of this company. It's disturbing, it's extensive, and it's thoroughly documented." The first piece of evidence was audio. Richard's voice unmistakable as he used racial slurs to describe employees in what he'd thought was a private conversation with James Hartwell. The CFO, sitting at the far end of the table, looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. Then came video footage from security cameras, incident after incident of harassment, humiliation, abuse. Richard berating employees for minor mistakes. Richard mocking a female executive's appearance. Richard deliberately leaving messes for Naomi to clean while entertaining clients, laughing about it afterward. Financial records followed, showing systematic wage theft from minority employees, pay disparities that clearly constituted discrimination, benefits cut selectively from the most vulnerable workers. Patricia narrated each revelation with prosecutorial precision, building a case that grew more damning with every slide. The buried sexual harassment settlements came next. 3 women whose complaints had been paid off and hidden, their non-disclosure agreements purchased with company money that should have been disclosed to the board and shareholders. Patricia had somehow obtained their testimony, their willingness to break NDAs now that Richard's legal exposure made the agreements unenforceable. Then came the proof of discriminatory hiring practices, statistical analysis showing that under Richard's leadership, minority candidates were systematically excluded from advancement opportunities. The documentation was so thorough, so irrefutable, that several board members were openly taking notes, already calculating their own liability exposure. Finally, the morning's assault footage played on the screen. Naomi watching herself being slapped, humiliated, physically removed from the building. The timestamp showed 7:42 a.m., less than 10 hours ago, though it felt like it had happened in a different lifetime. Board members' expressions shifted from discomfort to horror to disgust. Richard's attempts at denial crumbled as evidence piled upon evidence. "This is taken out of context," he tried. "These employees were incompetent. I was protecting the company's interests." "By stealing from them?" Patricia asked mildly. "By harassing them? By creating a hostile work environment that's exposed this company to millions in legal liability? Mr. Caldwell, you haven't protected this company. You've destroyed it. The only question now is whether Miss Rivers chooses to rebuild it or let it die." Richard collapsed into his chair, all rage suddenly draining from him as reality crashed through denial. His empire was gone. His reputation was destroyed. Everything he'd built on his father's foundation had been stripped away in less than 30 minutes. Naomi spoke for the first time since entering the room, her voice steady and clear. "I'm not here for revenge, Mr. Caldwell. I'm here for justice. Not just for me, but for every person you've harmed. The board has voted to remove you, and I accept that decision. Caldwell Industries will be transformed into something your father would recognize, something that values people as much as profit. You're fired, Mr. Caldwell, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building. You have 1 hour to collect your personal belongings. Richard stared at her, seeing her truly for perhaps the first time. Not a maid, not property, but a person with power, with dignity, with the ability to demand accountability. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. What could he possibly say? Security arrived, summoned by Lawrence. Richard stood on shaking legs, looking around the conference room at board members who wouldn't meet his eyes. The walk to the doors took forever, each step a public admission of complete defeat. At the threshold, he turned back one final time. "This isn't over," he tried, but even he could hear how hollow the threat sounded. "Yes, Mr. Caldwell," Naomi said quietly. "It is." The doors closed behind him, and Naomi finally allowed herself to breathe. The assault footage hit news networks at exactly 6:15 p.m., coordinated releases across every major outlet that turned Richard Caldwell's worst moment into inescapable national spectacle. CNN led with it during their evening broadcast. MSNBC interrupted regular programming. Local stations made it their top story. Within minutes, the video was everywhere. Richard's hands striking Naomi's face, the crack audible over security camera audio, her stumbling backward as he screamed slurs, the termination papers thrown at her in the lobby, her belongings scattered across marble floors like trash. But the networks didn't just show the assault. They told the full story, information clearly provided by Patricia's media team. Naomi Rivers, 52-year-old maid and grandmother, had inherited $80 billion the same morning her employer attacked her. Richard Caldwell, Millionaire CEO, had just been removed from his own company by the woman he'd abused. The dramatic irony was almost theatrical, a morality tale so perfectly constructed it seemed scripted. Social media exploded with velocity that surprised even Patricia's communications specialists. Heart Justice for Naomi began trending within 30 minutes, spreading across platforms as people shared the footage, the backstory, their own experiences with abusive employers. Twitter erupted with commentary from activists, celebrities, ordinary workers who saw their own struggles reflected in Naomi's dignity. Instagram filled with infographics detailing workplace discrimination statistics. TikTok creators made videos explaining the case's broader implications for labor rights and corporate accountability. By 7 o'clock, protesters were gathering outside Caldwell Industries headquarters. They'd come organically, without organization, drawn by collective rage at injustice made visible. Workers from other companies, activists from labor rights groups, community members who'd watched people like Naomi suffer silently for years. They carried signs reading, "Dignity, not degradation," and "Workers are not disposable," and "Naomi's victory is everyone's victory." News cameras captured their chants, interviewed participants who shared stories of their own workplace abuse. A young black woman who'd been fired after reporting harassment. An older Latino man who'd worked 2 decades without a raise while his CEO bought vacation homes. A white woman whose disability accommodations had been denied until she sued. The protest wasn't just about Naomi anymore. It had become something larger, a referendum on how America treated its most vulnerable workers. Former Caldwell Industries employees began coming forward with their own stories, no longer bound by fear or non-disclosure agreements that Richard's legal exposure had effectively nullified. They spoke to reporters about the hostile environment, the discrimination, the systematic exploitation. Robert from accounting described being passed over for promotions despite superior qualifications. Lisa from marketing detailed sexual harassment she'd reported to HR only to have her complaint buried. A custodian named James talked about wage theft, hours worked without compensation, benefits cut without explanation. By 9 o'clock, Richard Caldwell's name had become shorthand for corporate cruelty. Think pieces appeared analyzing toxic leadership culture. Business schools scrambled to issue statements about their ethical curricula. Politicians from both parties released carefully worded condemnations, each trying to position themselves on the right side of public outrage. Richard had become a symbol, his individual monstrosity transformed into a broader indictment of systems that enabled abuse. Inside the conference room, Naomi watched the coverage on the large screen with mixed emotions. Vindication felt satisfying but uncomfortable, her private pain now public spectacle consumed by millions who didn't know her, who would forget her name within weeks while moving on to the next viral story. But Patricia assured her the exposure was necessary, that public accountability was the only thing preventing powerful people from burying inconvenient truths. The board had recessed briefly after Richard's removal, members needing time to process the revelations and calculate their own liability. They'd reconvened at 6:30 p.m., subdued and visibly shaken, ready to hear what came next. That's when Caroline Caldwell had entered the conference room. She looked smaller than her 25 years, her eyes red from crying, her professional composure barely maintained. Lawrence Fitzpatrick stood to introduce her, but Caroline waved him off. "They know who I am. Richard Caldwell's daughter. The person who should have stopped him years ago but didn't." Naomi felt her chest tighten seeing Caroline's anguish. This young woman had been like a daughter to her once, before Richard's transformation had created distance between them. Caroline took a seat near Naomi, pointedly not at the head of the table where her father had stood. "I need to testify about what I've witnessed," Caroline began, her voice shaking but determined. "Not just this morning's assault, though I saw that too and will never forget the sound of his hand hitting Naomi's face, but years of cruelty that I watched and did nothing about until it was almost too late." She detailed specific incidents with painful precision. Richard mocking Jaden's asthma during a company party, saying Naomi probably couldn't afford proper medical care because she was too lazy to get a real job. Richard forcing Naomi to work through her daughter's funeral arrangements because he'd scheduled an important client dinner. Richard deliberately leaving messes in his office, then berating Naomi in front of visitors for slovenly maintenance standards. "He did it to others too," Caroline continued, her shame evident in every word. "I watched him destroy careers, humiliate dedicated employees, create an environment where people were afraid to speak up because they knew he'd retaliate. And I said nothing because he's my father, because I benefited from the wealth his cruelty generated, because speaking up would have been uncomfortable." She turned to Naomi directly. "You were more of a parent to me than he ever was. You listened when I was struggling. You cared about me as a person, not as an extension of the Caldwell name. And I repaid that by staying silent while he abused you. I'm so sorry, Naomi. I should have done something years ago." "You're doing something now," Naomi said softly. "That takes courage." "It takes the bare minimum of decency," Caroline replied bitterly. "I've been working with Patricia for 6 months, gathering evidence, trying to build a case that would protect employees when the truth finally came out. But I should have acted sooner. I should have chosen right over easy." She addressed the board then, her voice strengthening. "My father destroyed the company my grandfather built. Edmund Caldwell believed in ethical leadership, in treating people with dignity, in using corporate power to lift communities rather than exploit them. Richard perverted everything grandfather stood for. If you're serious about transformation, you need to understand that the rot goes deeper than one man's cruelty. The entire culture needs to be rebuilt from scratch." The board members listened in uncomfortable silence. Some looked genuinely disturbed by Caroline's testimony. Others were clearly calculating how to distance themselves from Richard's actions, how to claim ignorance they probably didn't deserve. Lawrence cleared his throat. "Ms. Caldwell, your testimony will be included in our formal investigation. We appreciate your cooperation and your courage." Outside the conference room, Richard had witnessed his daughter's entrance on his way to collect his belongings, security escort hovering nearby. He'd tried to approach her, but Caroline had looked through him as if he were already gone, and that dismissal had shattered something in him. His daughter's betrayal hurt worse than losing the company, worse than the public humiliation, because it meant he'd lost the last person who might have believed his version of events. Their relationship had ended in that hallway, destroyed not by Caroline's testimony, but by the truth that testimony revealed. Richard had chosen power over family, cruelty over connection, and now he was facing the consequences of those choices alone. The deeper investigation had begun immediately, Patricia's team coordinating with board-appointed auditors to examine every aspect of Caldwell Industries' operations. What they found in those first hours was somehow worse than the already damning evidence they'd presented. The HR department hadn't just buried complaints. They'd actively colluded in harassment, creating a system designed to protect abusers and silence victim D. Middle managers throughout the company had enforced Richard's discriminatory policies, their own performance reviews tied to compliance with his toxic directives. Financial irregularities went beyond creative accounting into outright fraud, embezzlement schemes, tax evasion, environmental violations that had been deliberately hidden from regulators. Suppliers came forward with stories of being cheated, contracts obtained through bribery, quality standards ignored in favor of whoever offered Richard personal kickbacks. The scope of corruption shocked even the most cynical board members, revealing a company so thoroughly compromised that simple leadership change wouldn't fix it. Naomi absorbed these revelations with growing understanding of the task ahead. Transformation wouldn't mean tweaking policies or replacing executives. It would require gutting the entire corporate culture, rebuilding systems from their foundations, establishing accountability that reached every level of the organization. The work would take years, would face resistance, would demand sustained commitment to values that couldn't be sacrificed for quarterly profits. "Can it even be saved?" she asked Patricia during a brief recess. "Or should I just let it die?" "That's your choice," Patricia replied. "But remember, 2,000 people work here. Most of them had nothing to do with Richard's cruelty. They're just trying to survive, like you were. Letting it die punishes them, not him." The decision crystallized for Naomi then. She'd rebuild, not for Richard or his enablers, but for people like Robert and Lisa and James, for workers who deserve better than what this company had become. Diana Caldwell arrived at the building at 8:30 p.m., driven from her countryside estate after seeing the news coverage. Naomi was reviewing employee files when Diana requested a private meeting, and despite everything, Naomi agreed. Diana looked older than Naomi remembered, her elegant features marked by grief that had clearly preceded her husband's public destruction. She sat across from Naomi in a small conference room, hands folded in her lap, posture perfect but fragile. "I knew," Diana said without preamble. "Not everything, but enough. I knew Richard was cruel. I knew he was destroying what Edmund built, and I did nothing because it was easier to hide in the countryside than confront what my husband had become." She met Naomi's eyes with obvious effort. "I watched you raise your daughter while working full-time. I watched you grieve Maya while caring for Jaden. I watched Richard treat you with contempt, and I told myself it wasn't my business, that workplace issues were separate from family issues, but that was cowardice dressed up as propriety." "Why are you telling me this?" Naomi asked, not unkindly. "Because I owe you an apology that won't fix anything but needs to be said anyway. Because I'm filing for divorce and want you to know it's not strategic self-preservation. Because my daughter is braver than I ever was, and watching her testify against her father made me realize I should have done the same years ago." Diana pulled out her phone, showing Naomi a legal document. "I've instructed my attorneys to cooperate fully with any investigations. I'll testify about Richard's character, his behavior at home, his contempt for his father's values. I have recordings of conversations, emails, documentation that might be useful. It's not much, but it's what I can offer." "Why now?" Naomi asked. "Why not when it might have prevented some of this?" "Because I'm weak," Diana said simply. "Because I prioritized my comfort over other people's dignity. Because I was complicit in my husband's cruelty through my silence. I can't undo that, Naomi. But I can choose differently going forward, even if it's too late to matter." The two women sat in silence for a long moment. Naomi thought about forgiveness, about complicity, about how many people had enabled Richard's abuse through action or inaction. Diana's guilt was genuine, but it didn't erase her years of willful blindness. "Help Caroline," Naomi finally said. "Your daughter is trying to do the right thing, and she needs family support. Be the mother she deserves, even if you weren't the wife Edmund deserved." Diana nodded, tears finally falling. "I will. And Naomi? For whatever it's worth, Edmund would be proud of you, not for the money or the power, but for maintaining your dignity when everything was designed to strip it away. That's what he valued most, and it's what Richard never understood." She left shortly after, and Naomi watched her go, thinking about systems of complicity that enabled cruelty. Richard was the villain, but people like Diana had created the conditions where his villainy could flourish unchallenged. Justice required holding both accountable, though in different ways. The night stretched on, reporters camped outside, protesters still chanting, social media still erupting, and Naomi at the center of it all, wondering if she was ready for what came next. Naomi stood in the doorway of Richard's former office, her office now, and felt the weight of 20 years pressing against her chest. This was the room where he'd made her scrub floors on her hands and knees while entertaining clients. The space where he'd mocked her grandson's illness and questioned her intelligence. The executive suite where, just days ago, his hand had struck her face. Patricia stood beside her, understanding the significance of this moment. "You don't have to use this office. We can put you anywhere in the building." "No," Naomi said quietly. "This is exactly where I need to be. He used this space to diminish people. I'm going to use it to lift them up." That matters. She'd spent the weekend preparing for her first day as CEO, working with Patricia and Caroline to develop immediate action plans, while news coverage continued its relentless cycle. The assault footage had been viewed over 50 million times across platforms. Richard's name remained trending. Caldwell Industries stock had initially plummeted on news of the leadership change, investors spooked by uncertainty, but Naomi's team had prepared for that reaction. Monday morning arrived with protesters still gathered outside, though their signs had shifted from outrage to support. "Naomi Rivers for president," one read. "This is what justice looks like," declared another. Camera crews remained camped at every entrance, hoping for footage of the maid-turned-mogul arriving for her first official day. Naomi had come early, at 6:00 a.m., deliberately choosing the time she'd always started her shifts. She wore another tailored suit, professional but not ostentatious, and carried a worn notebook that had belonged to her daughter Maya. She'd write her first CEO notes in that notebook, keeping her daughter's memory close during this overwhelming transition. The all-staff meeting was scheduled for 10:00 a.m. in the building's largest conference space, a room that could hold 2,000 employees when packed to capacity. Patricia had advised a video message instead, something controlled and polished, but Naomi had refused. "They need to see me as a person, not a PR strategy. These are the people who watched Richard abuse workers for 5 years. They need to know I'm different." By 9:45 a.m., the conference space was overflowing. Employees stood in aisles, sat on floors, pressed against back walls. Video feeds streamed to overflow rooms and remote workers. The energy was electric, anxious, filled with hope and skepticism in equal measure. They'd seen leaders promise change before. Edmund Caldwell had delivered on those promises. Richard had betrayed them. Which version would Naomi become? She walked onto the stage at exactly 10 o'clock a.m., no introduction needed, and the room erupted in applause that caught her completely off guard. People were standing, some crying, the sound washing over her like validation she hadn't realized she needed. She waited for it to subside, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the podium. "I'm Naomi Rivers," she began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Some of you know me as the woman who cleaned your offices for 20 years. Others know me from news coverage as the heir to an $80 billion fortune. Both of those things are true, and neither defines who I am or what this company will become." She paused, making eye contact with faces in the crowd. Robert from accounting, Lisa from marketing, James, the custodian, people who'd witnessed her humiliation and her transformation. "I'm not going to pretend I know how to be a CEO. I don't have an MBA or corporate training. What I have is 20 years of watching this company from the bottom, seeing how policies affect real people, understanding what dignity looks like when you're fighting to maintain it against systems designed to strip it away. That perspective is what I'm bringing to this leadership position." She outlined immediate changes with the clarity of someone who'd lived their necessity. Minimum wage increased to $35 per hour, effective immediately. Full benefits extended to all employees, including custodial and service staff. No exceptions. Mandatory anti-discrimination training for every person in the building, starting with whoever remained in leadership positions. External consultants would audit every department, investigating discrimination and harassment complaints that had been buried. "There will be leadership changes," she said, her voice firm. "People who enabled Richard Caldwell's cruelty, who participated in discrimination, who created hostile work environments will not remain in positions of power. This isn't revenge. It's accountability. If you've harmed people, there will be consequences. If you stayed silent when you should have spoken up, we'll discuss whether you can earn trust again. If you actively tried to do right despite the toxic culture, you'll be supported and promoted." The audience was completely silent now, processing the magnitude of what she was promising. "I know some of you are skeptical," Naomi continued. "You've heard promises before. You've watched leaders talk about values while maximizing profits at your expense. I can't erase that history with words. I can only prove through actions that this transformation is real. Judge me not by what I say today, but by what this company looks like in 6 months, a year, 5 years." She finished with a commitment that felt both terrifying and necessary. "Caldwell Industries will become a model for ethical corporate leadership, or it will cease to exist. Those are the only 2 options I'm willing to accept. Help me build the first one." The applause when she finished was different from before, not just supportive, but believing, tentatively hopeful that maybe, possibly, things could actually change. The purge of Richard's executive team began that afternoon and continued through the week. Patricia conducted exit interviews personally, documenting each person's role in the toxic culture. Some of the removals were straightforward. VP of Sales Brandon Foster, who'd laughed openly at Richard's cruelty and enforced discriminatory quotas, was escorted out by security when he tried to argue his severance package. Director of HR Linda Chen, despite her immunity deal, was terminated for actively burying harassment complaints. Others who'd participated in wage theft or financial fraud faced similar swift removal, but some cases were more complex. Sandra Bennett, the CFO who'd enabled Richard's creative accounting, broke down during her exit interview, genuine remorse evident in her confession. "I knew it was wrong," she sobbed. "I have a daughter. What do I tell her about the kind of person I became? Can I possibly make this right?" Naomi had sat in on that interview, studying the woman who'd helped Richard steal from vulnerable workers. "You'll cooperate completely with all investigations." You'll testify without immunity deals protecting you. You'll use your expertise to help uncover every financial crime Richard committed, and you'll accept whatever legal consequences come from your actions. That's not redemption, Ms. Bennett, but it's a start. Sandra had agreed, understanding that consequences were unavoidable, but perhaps survivable if faced with honesty rather than denial. The new leadership team was built methodically over that first month. Patricia Howard became general counsel, bringing her fierce commitment to justice into the company's legal framework. External hires filled positions requiring specific expertise. A chief diversity officer who'd transformed culture at 3 other corporations, a chief financial officer with impeccable ethical credentials, department heads chosen through blind interview processes that evaluated competence over connections. Caroline Caldwell presented a unique challenge. She wanted to remain with the company, to help rebuild what her father had destroyed. But Naomi worried about nepotism and the appearance of favoritism. "Earn it," Naomi told her during a difficult conversation. "Start in an entry-level position. Learn the business from the ground up, the way I did. Prove your competence, and if you're genuinely qualified, we'll talk about advancement." Caroline had accepted without argument, taking a position in operations and working longer hours than anyone else, determined to demonstrate that her commitment transcended her last name. Over 6 months, her competence became undeniable, her strategic thinking impressive, her dedication to ethical practices absolute. When the COO position opened, her promotion was based entirely on merit, though critics would always question it. The financial turnaround required capital injection that would have been impossible without Solomon's inheritance. Naomi met with her financial advisors, reviewing Caldwell Industries' catastrophic balance sheet. "How much do we need to stabilize operations and implement the reforms?" "Conservatively, $2 billion, David Chen said. "That covers debt restructuring, operational improvements, and cushion for the cultural transformation's costs." Naomi had written the check without hesitation, understanding that money meant nothing if it couldn't be used to create something meaningful. She'd renegotiated contracts ethically, refusing to exploit suppliers the way Richard had. She'd reached out personally to vendors he'd cheated, offering restitution and apologies, rebuilding relationships based on fairness rather than exploitation. Product development shifted toward sustainability and innovation. Research investments targeting technologies that addressed climate change and social equity. Community investment programs directed resources toward neighborhoods Caldwell Industries had previously ignored. The approach was long-term, prioritizing sustainable success over quarterly earnings, betting that ethical business practices would ultimately prove more profitable than exploitation. Wall Street was initially skeptical. Stock analysts criticized the unsustainable wage increases and naive ethical commitments. But over months, as employee productivity skyrocketed, as innovation accelerated, as community relationships generated goodwill that translated to market advantages, the reforms began proving their value. Stock prices recovered, then exceeded previous highs, demonstrating that dignity and profit weren't actually opposites. Naomi's personal transformation paralleled the company's. She'd moved from her cramped apartment into a beautiful home with space for Jaden and herself, rooms filled with light and possibilities she'd never imagined. The first thing she'd done was hire the best pediatric asthma specialists, getting Jaden proper treatment that reduced his attacks dramatically. Watching her grandson breathe easily, watching him play without struggling, was worth more than all of Solomon's billions. But wealth and power came with psychological costs she hadn't anticipated. Imposter syndrome plagued her constantly. She'd lie awake reviewing decisions, questioning her qualifications, wondering if she was fooling everyone, including herself. Patricia had insisted she see a therapist, and those sessions became essential for processing trauma from Richard's abuse, grief for Solomon and Maya, overwhelm from her transformed circumstances. "You're not an imposter," her therapist, Dr. Sarah Morrison, repeated during one particularly difficult session. "You're someone learning to occupy space you've always deserved, but were systematically denied. That's not fraud. That's justice." Learning to accept help proved harder than running a company. Naomi had spent 20 years doing everything herself, trusting only her own labor, never asking for support because she'd learned that vulnerability often led to exploitation. Now she had assistants, advisors, teams of people whose job was helping her succeed. Delegating felt like weakness until Caroline pointed out the obvious. You're not helping anyone by burning yourself out. Trust is what separates ethical leadership from Richard's control-freak tyranny. Friendships developed organically with Caroline and Patricia, relationships built on mutual respect rather than power dynamics. They met weekly for dinners where they weren't CEO and employees, but three women navigating impossible circumstances together. Caroline shared her ongoing grief over her father's betrayal. Patricia talked about her own journey as a black woman in corporate law. Naomi learned to be vulnerable, to admit struggles, to accept that asking for help wasn't failure, but wisdom. 6 months after taking control, Naomi stood in her office window watching the sun set over the city, holding her phone after a call with Jaden's doctor. His asthma was controlled. His lung function had improved to normal ranges. He was thriving in a new school, making friends, dreaming about futures that no longer terrified her. The company was transforming, slowly but measurably. Employee satisfaction scores had doubled. Productivity was up 30%. Innovation metrics exceeded industry standards. They weren't perfect yet, still had work to do rooting out remaining cultural problems, but the trajectory was undeniable. She thought about Solomon, wishing he could see what his gift had created. Not just wealth, but transformation. Not just power, but purpose. Not just her survival, but her ability to lift others. The grief would never fully heal, but gratitude lived alongside it now. Her phone buzzed. A text from Richard's lawyers, another threat about lawsuits that wouldn't survive preliminary hearings. She deleted it without responding, turning back to the quarterly reports Patricia had prepared. There was still so much work ahead, but for the first time in 20 years, Naomi felt something close to peace. Not because everything was perfect, but because she was building something that mattered, using power to create dignity rather than destroy it. Edmund Caldwell would have been proud, and maybe, finally, so was she. The criminal investigation began with federal agents arriving at Richard's penthouse apartment at 6:00 a.m., warrants authorizing seizure of financial records, computers, phones, anything that might document the systematic fraud Patricia's team had uncovered. Richard had watched in silk pajamas as strangers boxed up his life. His protests about privacy and rights met with professional indifference. They didn't care who he used to be. They only cared about the crimes he'd committed. The charges, when they came, were extensive and damning. Mail fraud, wire fraud, securities fraud, tax evasion, money laundering through shell corporations that existed only to hide illegal transactions. Each count carried potential prison time that added up to decades. Richard's attorney, a sharp corporate lawyer named Michael Brennan, had reviewed the evidence and delivered unwelcome truth. They have you on everything, Richard. Audio recordings, financial documents, testimony from executives who've already cooperated. Your only option is negotiating a plea deal that might keep you out of prison, though I can't promise even that. Civil lawsuits piled up like cordwood. 18 former employees filed discrimination and harassment claims, their cases strengthened by documentation Solomon's investigators had gathered and Patricia had preserved. Suppliers he'd cheated demanded restitution. Shareholders filed suit for financial misrepresentation. Each lawsuit came with asset freezes preventing Richard from moving money, from liquidating holdings, from accessing wealth he'd believed was untouchable. His country club membership was revoked by unanimous board vote, the letter arriving with cold formality. The club maintains standards of character and conduct. Your recent actions do not align with those standards. He'd been erased from an institution he'd considered his birthright, his name removed from donor plaques, his reservation at the annual gala canceled without explanation. Social ostracization followed swiftly. Friends who'd attended his parties and praised his business acumen now avoided his calls, their voicemails full or disconnected whenever he tried reaching out. Colleagues from industry associations stopped responding to emails. Networking contacts who'd once courted his attention now acted like he'd never existed. Richard discovered what Naomi had always known, that respect built on power, rather than character, evaporates the moment power disappears. Diana's divorce filing came through her attorneys, seeking half of whatever assets survived the legal carnage. Her petition included detailed documentation of his abusive behavior, his extramarital affairs, his financial improprieties. She'd stopped pretending their marriage meant anything, stopped protecting his reputation, and Richard felt betrayed, despite understanding he'd betrayed her first and more thoroughly. The penthouse went first, seized to satisfy debt obligations. Richard had watched movers pack artwork and furniture he'd selected to project success, each piece a performance of wealth rather than actual preference. They'd left him basic necessities and taken everything else, the space echoing with absence by the time they'd finished. He'd moved into a modest apartment in a neighborhood he'd never have visited voluntarily, a one-bedroom unit with thin walls and aging appliances that reminded him uncomfortably of descriptions of where Naomi had lived. The irony wasn't lost on him, though he quickly buried awareness beneath resentment. This was temporary, he told himself. Once legal issues resolved, once people remembered his capabilities rather than his mistakes, he'd rebuild. But employment proved impossible. He'd submitted resumes to dozens of companies, leveraging whatever remained of his network, pitching himself as a leader who'd learned hard lessons about ethical management. Every application was rejected, often without explanation. The few interviews he'd secured had ended abruptly once his name triggered recognition. "We've decided to pursue other candidates," became a familiar refrain, corporate speak for, "We've seen the assault footage and your name is toxic." Industry blackballing was comprehensive and coordinated. Word had spread through executive networks that Richard Caldwell was radioactive, that hiring him meant inheriting his scandals, that association with him damaged corporate reputations. He'd become unemployable, his decades of experience meaningless against documented evidence of his character. Legal fees consumed his savings with terrifying speed. Michael Brennan billed $400 per hour, and fighting federal charges required constant consultation, motion filings, discovery reviews. Richard watched his bank balance drop week after week, from comfortable cushion to concerning depletion to panic-inducing scarcity. He'd never worried about money before, never understood how financial stress consumed mental space and emotional energy until he was experiencing it personally. He'd sold his luxury watch collection, his designer wardrobe, anything with resale value. Standing in a consignment shop while a board clerk assessed his Rolex felt humiliating in ways he'd never anticipated. The money helped briefly, then was gone, consumed by living expenses and legal bills that never stopped accumulating. Identity crisis hit harder than financial pressure. Richard had defined himself by titles, possessions, power over others. Without CEO credentials, without wealth signaling success, without employees to dominate. Who was he? The question tormented him during sleepless nights in his bare apartment, the silence broken only by neighbors he'd once have considered beneath him, living lives he'd once have mocked. Moments of self-reflection sometimes broke through his defenses. He'd remember his father Edmund, disappointed but loving, trying to teach lessons about character that Richard had dismissed as weakness. He'd think about employees he'd destroyed, recognizing their humanity now that he shared their vulnerability. He'd see Naomi's face as his hand struck her, and shame would flood him before he buried it beneath rationalizations and blame. But genuine remorse couldn't survive contact with his ego. Each moment of clarity would dissolve into bitter resentment, into conviction that he was the real victim, that circumstances had conspired against him, that if people just understood his perspective, they'd recognize he wasn't really the villain social media had made him. Michael Brennan had suggested a public apology might help his legal situation, might demonstrate remorse that could influence sentencing if conviction became inevitable. Richard had agreed, hiring a PR consultant to craft something appropriately contrite. His first attempt, delivered via video statement, had been a masterclass in insincerity. "I apologize if my leadership style offended anyone," he'd read from a script, his voice flat and resentful. "In the pressure of running a major corporation, sometimes communication can be misinterpreted. I never intended to hurt anyone, and I hope people can understand the context of a demanding business environment." The response had been immediate and brutal. Social media tore the apology apart, highlighting every deflection, every refusal to take real responsibility, every suggestion that his victims had simply misunderstood his intentions. Richard Caldwell's non-apology apology trended for days, becoming a teaching moment about how not to seek forgiveness. His lawyer had called it catastrophic for his case, evidence of character issues that would influence any jury. Caroline had refused his calls since his removal from the company. He'd tried reaching her weekly at first, leaving voicemails that progressed from anger to pleading to bitter accusations. She never responded, and eventually he'd learned through his lawyer that she'd blocked his number completely. His daughter had chosen Naomi over him, had betrayed her own father for a woman who'd cleaned toilets, and Richard couldn't process that rejection without rage that consumed whatever grief lived beneath it. He'd gone to Diana's countryside estate once, desperate and unannounced, hoping to convince her to drop the divorce or at least speak with him. She'd met him at the door with her attorney present and a restraining order ready for service. "You don't get to show up here anymore, Richard. You don't get access to me or Caroline. Accept it and move forward, or you'll be arrested for violating this order." The restraining order had been served by a sheriff's deputy who'd recognized Richard's name and smirked while explaining the terms. Another humiliation, another person witnessing his fall. Another reminder that he'd lost even the basic respect law enforcement granted ordinary citizens. His isolation grew total. No family, no friends, no colleagues, no allies. People he'd once commanded now avoided him actively. He'd become a cautionary tale, a warning about hubris and cruelty, his name invoked whenever conversations turned to toxic leadership or workplace abuse. 3 months after losing everything, Richard hit bottom on a Tuesday evening in his apartment that felt more like a cell than a home. He sat on his second-hand couch, the only furniture besides a mattress and small table, eating convenience store ramen because cooking required energy he couldn't summon. His reflection in the blank television screen showed a man who'd aged years in months, stress carving lines that prosperity had kept at bay. His health had declined noticeably. Stress-induced hypertension, his doctor warned, along with signs of depression that medication could help but wouldn't cure. He'd lost weight, not from intentional dieting, but from poverty making food a calculation rather than a given. His expensive haircut had grown out shaggy because barbers cost money he needed for rent. Everything about him screamed failure, and he couldn't escape awareness of how far he'd fallen. A moment of clarity hit him in that bare apartment, sharp and undeniable. He thought about Naomi eating cheap food in similar spaces, caring for Jaden while working full-time, maintaining dignity despite circumstances designed to destroy it. She'd survived everything he was currently experiencing, had done it for years, had emerged stronger rather than broken. And he'd punished her for that survival, had used her vulnerability as entertainment, had struck her face because his own failures demanded a victim. He understood, finally, what he'd done. Not just to Naomi, but to dozens of people, hundreds maybe, all the workers he'd exploited and humiliated and discarded. He'd wielded power like a weapon, had confused domination with leadership, had believed his cruelty was somehow justified by business pressures or competitive necessity. But sitting in poverty, experiencing the vulnerability he'd once mocked, he couldn't maintain those delusions anymore. The realization should have brought relief, the beginning of genuine transformation. But Richard's epiphany came wrapped in self-pity that poisoned whatever wisdom it contained. He understood what he'd done, yes, but he couldn't quite accept that consequences were deserved rather than excessive, that he was experiencing justice rather than persecution. He wanted to talk to someone about this clarity, wanted to process the understanding threatening to crack his carefully maintained denial. His lawyer would just see legal implications. His ex-wife had a restraining order. His daughter had blocked him. There was only one person who might understand, who'd lived through both his cruelty and her own transformation, who'd proven that change was possible even after everything seemed lost. He needed to see Naomi. Not for mercy, he told himself, though mercy would have been welcome. Not for forgiveness, though he craved that too. But for closure, for understanding, for some acknowledgement from the woman whose life he'd tried to destroy that maybe, possibly, he could still become someone different than who he'd been. Richard stood from the couch, finding his phone and searching for Rivers Caldwell Industries' office number. He'd go there tomorrow, would request a meeting, would try to explain what he'd finally understood even though words felt inadequate to the task. He didn't know if Naomi would see him. Probably she wouldn't. But he had to try, had to take this first step toward accountability even if it led nowhere, had to face what he'd done and who he'd become before the weight of it crushed whatever remained of his capacity for change. Outside his window, the city lights glowed with possibilities he no longer had access to. Richard watched them until exhaustion pulled him toward his bare mattress, knowing that tomorrow he'd go to the company he'd lost and ask the woman he'd destroyed for something he had no right to request, the chance to be seen not as what he'd been, but as what he might still become. Richard arrived at Rivers Caldwell Industries on a Wednesday morning, taking the bus because his car had been sold months ago to pay legal fees. He stood across the street for 10 minutes, gathering courage to approach the building where he'd once commanded absolute authority. The protesters were gone now, replaced by normal foot traffic, employees arriving for work at a company that no longer bore his name. Security recognized him immediately when he entered the lobby. The guard, a young man named Marcus who'd witnessed his removal months ago, reached for his radio with practiced efficiency. "Mr. Caldwell is here. Should I escort him out, or does Ms. Rivers want to be notified?" Richard waited in humiliating silence while Marcus spoke quietly into his radio, aware of employees staring as they passed through the lobby. Some recognized him, their expressions ranging from curiosity to contempt. Others simply saw a disheveled middle-aged man who clearly didn't belong in this space anymore. "Ms. Rivers will see you," Marcus said finally, surprise evident in his voice. "5th floor, executive suite. You remember the way." The elevator ride felt eternal. Richard caught his reflection in the polished steel doors and barely recognized himself. He'd lost 30 pounds, his expensive suit now hanging loose on a frame diminished by stress and inadequate nutrition. His hair, once professionally maintained, needed cutting. Dark circles under his eyes spoke to sleepless nights and health declining from poverty's constant pressure. He looked exactly like the struggling workers he'd once mocked, and the irony burned. Naomi's assistant, a professional woman named Jennifer, who'd once been Richard's assistant before switching allegiance during his fall, greeted him with cool courtesy. "Ms. Rivers can give you 15 minutes. Please wait here." He sat in the reception area outside what had been his office, the space transformed beyond recognition. Where he'd displayed awards and photos celebrating his achievements, Naomi had installed artwork from local artists, pieces celebrating community and diversity. Employee recognition plaques covered one wall, celebrating people whose names Richard had never bothered learning. Everything that had screamed his ego had been erased, replaced with values he'd dismissed as weakness. "She'll see you now," Jennifer said, and Richard stood on shaking legs. The office where he'd humiliated Naomi countless times, where he'd made her scrub floors while he entertained clients, where he'd struck her face just months ago, was now completely hers. She sat behind the desk that had been his, wearing a professional suit that probably cost more than his monthly rent, looking powerful and composed in ways that made his chest tight with emotions he couldn't name. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. Not the power position he'd once occupied, but the supplicant's seat, lower and less comfortable, designed to reinforce hierarchy he now existed on the wrong side of. "Naomi," he started, his voice cracking. "Thank you for seeing me. I know I don't deserve your time." "No," she agreed calmly. "You don't. But I'm curious what you came here to say." Richard had rehearsed this speech during the bus ride, had practiced in his apartment mirror, had tried to craft words that captured both his understanding and his desperation. But sitting across from her, seeing her strength and dignity, everything he'd prepared dissolved into incoherent pleading. "I'm sorry," he said, and tears he hadn't planned started falling. "I'm so sorry for everything, for hitting you, for the years of abuse, for treating you like you were nothing when you were working harder and better than I ever did. I understand now what I did, what I became. Living where you lived, eating what you ate, experiencing the poverty I mocked you for. It's shown me things I was too privileged and cruel to see before." He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, aware he looked pathetic, but unable to maintain composure. "I've lost everything. My company, my family, my reputation, my wealth. I'm facing prison time for crimes I absolutely committed. I know I deserve consequences. But I'm begging you, Naomi. I need help. A reference, a recommendation, anything that might help me find employment. I've learned, I promise I've learned. I could be different, could be better. Please, just give me a chance to prove I can change." The speech had been genuine and self-pitying in equal measure, his understanding poisoned by his inability to accept consequences without resentment. He'd recognized his cruelty, but couldn't quite surrender his conviction that he deserved mercy anyway. Naomi studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady and clear, carrying weight that commanded attention. "You taught me something important, Mr. Caldwell. You taught me that power reveals character. When you had power, you chose cruelty. You chose to abuse people who couldn't fight back, to exploit vulnerability, to use your position to diminish others so you could feel bigger. That wasn't stress or pressure or business necessity. That was who you chose to be when you thought there would be no consequences." She leaned forward slightly. "Now that I have power, I choose justice. Not revenge, though revenge would be satisfying. Justice, which means ensuring you can never abuse power again." Richard felt hope draining as she continued, her words precise as surgical instruments. "Your severance package from Caldwell Industries has been calculated. It equals exactly what you paid me over 20 years of employment. Minimum wage, no benefits, adjusted only for inflation. That comes to approximately $273,000, which sounds substantial until you divide it by 20 years of labor. It's yours, Mr. Caldwell. Live on it, learn from it, experience what you expected me to survive on while you spent that much on a single vacation." She pulled out a document, sliding it across the desk. "This is an industry-wide notification that's been sent to every major corporation and executive placement firm. It details your crimes, your character, your documented abuses. It ensures that no company will hire you for leadership positions, that your name triggers immediate rejection. You're not blackballed from all employment. You can find work, just not work that gives you power over vulnerable people ever again. Richard's hands trembled as he read the document, seeing his career prospects evaporate in formal language that left no room for rehabilitation or second chances in positions of authority. Your legal settlement includes mandatory community service, Naomi continued. 500 hours over 2 years, working directly with organizations that serve low-wage workers and address workplace exploitation. You'll listen to their stories, understand their struggles, contribute labor without authority. Maybe exposure to people's humanity will teach you what wealth and privilege prevented you from learning. "This is too much," Richard whispered. "This is my whole life destroyed." "No," Naomi said firmly. "This is accountability. I'm not destroying your life. I'm ensuring the destruction you cause to others can't continue. You're alive, Mr. Caldwell. You're not in prison, though you deserve to be. You have your severance, which is more than you gave me when you fired me. You can rebuild, just not in ways that harm people. That's not excessive. That's justice." She stood, signaling the meeting's end. "I hope you use these consequences to become better. I hope you develop genuine remorse that isn't contaminated by self-pity. I hope you eventually understand that the real tragedy isn't your fall, but the cruelty that made it necessary. But whether you change or not is your responsibility, not mine. I've given you exactly what you gave me, the bare minimum necessary for survival. What you build from that is up to you." Richard stood on shaking legs, understanding finally that begging wouldn't work, that charm and manipulation had no power here, that Naomi had become someone he couldn't diminish or control or escape consequences from. "Goodbye, Mr. Caldwell," she said, returning to her desk and her work, dismissing him as thoroughly as he'd once dismissed her. He walked out of her office, through reception where Jennifer didn't look up, into the elevator that carried him back to the lobby, out onto streets where he was just another struggling person in a city that didn't care about his former status. Broken but alive, facing consequences that felt crushing, but were, he had to admit in his most honest moments, less than what he deserved. 6 months after Richard's final visit. Rivers Caldwell. Industries was thriving beyond even optimistic projections. The company's stock had risen 40% since Naomi's takeover, driven by ethical practices that somehow translated to sustainable profits. Investors had initially been skeptical, but quarterly reports told undeniable stories. Productivity up, innovation accelerating, employee retention at industry-leading levels, community partnerships generating goodwill that created market advantages competitors couldn't replicate. Employee satisfaction scores were the highest in the industry, validated by external surveys that corporations couldn't manipulate. Workers praised the living wages, comprehensive benefits, respectful culture, opportunities for advancement based on merit rather than connections. The company had become a destination employer, attracting talent that would have previously chosen more prestigious firms. Innovation awards accumulated on shelves where Richard's ego trophies once sat. A sustainable manufacturing process that reduced environmental impact while cutting costs. A supply chain transparency initiative that became industry standard. Products designed for accessibility that opened new markets while serving previously ignored communities. Rivers Caldwell Industries was proving that ethical leadership enhanced rather than limited success. The company had become a model for corporate responsibility, featured in business school case studies, invited to speak at conferences, held up as evidence that capitalism didn't require exploitation to generate profit. Naomi deflected most praise, insisting the transformation belonged to employees who'd always wanted to do good work but needed leadership that supported rather than hindered them. The $10 million Employee Hardship Fund had helped hundreds of families, providing emergency assistance when medical crises or family emergencies threatened their stability. Unlike traditional corporate charity, which often came with conditions and publicity requirements, the fund operated with dignity and discretion. No one had to perform poverty to access help. They just had to be part of the Rivers-Caldwell family, and the family took care of its own. The on-site child care center, built in space that had been Richard's private office, operated at cost with sliding scale fees based on income. Jaden spent afternoons there sometimes, playing with children whose parents worked throughout the building, his asthma controlled by the best care Solomon's fortune could buy. The Diversity Council wielded real power, reviewing policies and practices, ensuring transformation wasn't just cosmetic, but structural. The quarterly town hall meeting drew 2,000 employees to the main conference space, video feeds streaming to remote workers and satellite offices. Naomi stood on stage, Caroline beside her as COO, Patricia in the front row as general counsel, all of them women who'd fought for this transformation and earned their positions through competence rather than connections. "I'm pleased to announce," Naomi said, her voice carrying across the packed room, "that Rivers-Caldwell Industries will be implementing a profit-sharing program. Beginning next quarter, 15% of net profits will be distributed to all employees based on tenure and contribution, because the people who create value deserve to benefit from the value they create." The standing ovation lasted 3 full minutes, employees on their feet cheering a decision that honored their labor with something more substantial than pizza parties and empty praise. Some were crying, overcome by recognition they'd never expected in corporate America. Others were calculating what profit sharing might mean for their families, their mortgages, their children's education. Naomi's eyes found faces in the crowd. Robert from accounting, who'd been promoted to director, Lisa from marketing, now leading entire campaigns, James, the custodian, whose suggestions about operational efficiency had been implemented and rewarded. People whose potential had been suppressed under Richard's leadership, now flourishing because someone finally saw their worth. After the meeting, she walked through the child care center, watching Jaden play with other children, his breathing clear and unlabored. His asthma was controlled, his health transformed by medical care that should have been accessible regardless of his grandmother's wealth. He attended a private school where teachers nurtured his intelligence and creativity, where he had friends and opportunities, and a future that didn't terrify her anymore. "Grandma," he called when he saw her. "Look at the building I made." She admired his block structure, elaborate and creative, and felt gratitude so intense it was almost painful. This boy, this beautiful child who'd struggled for breath while she'd scrubbed Richard's floors, was thriving, not just surviving but flourishing, safe and healthy and loved, in a world she'd helped make marginally better. Caroline approached as Naomi was leaving, her professional demeanor softening into something like friendship. "The quarterly numbers are finalized. We're up 12% over projections. The ethical approach is working, Naomi. We're proving it's possible." "You're proving it," Naomi corrected. "I just gave permission. You and Patricia and the whole team are doing the actual work." "We're doing it together," Caroline replied. "That's what makes it work. Collaboration instead of domination. Respect instead of fear. Turns out my grandfather was right all along." That evening, alone in her office after everyone had gone home, Naomi stood at the window watching the sun set over the city. She held a framed photograph of Uncle Solomon, taken from his office after his death, his smile genuine and proud. Tears fell as she whispered thanks to a man she'd never properly known, but who'd given her everything that mattered. The journey from maid to mogul, from victim to victor, had been impossible and inevitable, traumatic and transformative. The bruise on her cheek had faded months ago, But memory remained, and she was glad for it. She never wanted to forget what powerlessness felt like, what dignity cost when you had to fight for it daily, what it meant to be dismissed and diminished by people who wielded authority without accountability. But she'd transformed that pain into purpose, that degradation into dignity for thousands. Victory wasn't destroying Richard, though his consequences were deserved. Victory was building something so fundamentally different that his cruelty became irrelevant, creating a world where such cruelty couldn't thrive because systems prevented rather than enabled it. Her phone rang. Jaden asking about dinner, his voice bright with the unself-conscious joy of a child who felt secure. "Can we have tacos? And can we watch that movie after?" "Absolutely," she said, smiling genuinely for the first time that day. "I'm coming home right now." She gathered her things, turned off the lights, and walked out of the office that had been the site of so much cruelty and was now the headquarters of something better. The building's lobby was empty, security nodding respectfully as she passed. Outside, her car waited, comfortable but not ostentatious, wealth deployed for practical utility rather than status performance. Driving through the city toward home, toward Jaden and dinner, and the ordinary joys of life, lived without constant fear. Naomi reflected on everything that had changed and everything that hadn't. She was wealthier than she'd ever imagined, more powerful than should have been possible, more successful than anyone had predicted. But she was still herself, still the woman who valued dignity and justice and the simple grace of showing up for people who needed her. Richard was somewhere in this same city, living in poverty, facing consequences, hopefully learning lessons that wealth and privilege had prevented him from absorbing earlier. She didn't hate him anymore. Didn't forgive him either, not fully, but had reached something like indifference to his fate. He was no longer her problem. He was his own. This is what justice looks like, she thought, pulling into her driveway where lights glowed warm and welcoming. Not revenge that leaves everyone diminished, not mercy that ignores accountability, but transformation that builds something better from the wreckage of what was broken. She walked inside to the smell of dinner and the sound of Jaden's laughter, to the life she'd earned through 20 years of dignity and 3 months of power wielded ethically. Tomorrow, she'd return to work, to the endless challenges of ethical leadership in systems designed for exploitation. But tonight, she was just grandma, making tacos with her grandson, watching movies, living the ordinary, extraordinary life that mattered more than any fortune. Justice looked like this. Transformation felt like this. And for the first time in 20 years, Naomi Rivers was finally, completely, genuinely at peace. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this incredible journey. If this story touched your heart, wait until you see what's coming next. It's even more powerful and inspiring than you can imagine. So don't go anywhere. Click on that video showing on your screen right now to dive into another amazing story that will absolutely blow your mind. Trust me, you won't regret it.